Here today. I'm going to be doing an interview with Dr. Bryan Méndez, who is an education specialist at the Space Sciences Laboratory in California. So first, I'd like to kind of ask you kind of a basic question about your work. So can you talk a little bit about the work you do at the laboratory?
Sure. So even though the place is called the Space Sciences Laboratory, of course there's space science going on there, but we've also had a team there since the mid 90s, and I haven't always been part of it, but since the mid 90s we've had a team that does education and public outreach there. A huge majority of projects at the Space Sciences Lab are funded by NASA. And NASA has had education as a key component of its activities actually since its inception. It's actually education is written into NASA's charter. But in the 90s, NASA they started a program to incorporate education and public outreach as a part of all their science missions, and it actually was a funded percentage of every science project that happened at the science level there. So it wasn't necessarily NASA has a very complicated organizational structure, which has changed a lot over the years. But the Space Science Division, as it's known now, is kind of responsible for all of the kind of the robotic missions to planets, for the space telescopes, and those kinds of programs. So it's it also funds a lot of researchers around the country who are doing, kind of individual projects in space science. Mm-hmm. So it's not the astronauts part of NASA or the airplanes part of NASA. They all do their own education thing too, and those are great. But the space science part had this program of actually putting, a certain percentage of time, and so that actually ended up creating a bunch of interesting kind of people who had science backgrounds as well as education interests, and they were starting to come together. When I just had finished my Ph.D., I started talking to some of the folks so I got my Ph.D. in astrophysics at Berkeley. And then I didn't even know that there was this group who were just up the hill from me who were doing education and public outreach for NASA. So as I was just finishing up, I went up there and talked to them and found out that, they had an opening coming. So, I applied for this job because it was just like the perfect thing, because I had always loved doing outreach, and education. And in fact, I was doing a lot of teaching as a graduate student and found that I kind of had a knack and a passion for it. And so I really, really wanted to make education a key part of my work. So when I found out they had that opening, I was just all over it.
Awesome.
Turns out I didn't get the job, actually. Somebody else beat me out for it. But then I wanted to do that work so badly that I went up there and I talked to the people who were doing it, and I just wanted to know more about the field, what kind of things that I could do to work toward doing that. And so they got to know me, through those conversations, and then the person who they hired backed out on them.
Oh wow!
And they called me up and they're like, we talked to you, we know you, and yeah, do you still want the job? And I was like, yes.
That's amazing. One thing I think is really cool about that is the fact that because it's publicly funded, NASA kind of recognizes that the American people are funding this, so it's like how to get them involved and to appreciate kind of what their funding's been able to make possible. I think it's great.
Yeah. There was an administrator who once put it in a really nice way. He talked about how, everything that NASA does is like you say, funded by the American people. So the American people should get some kind of return on their investment.
Right.
And when their investment in, say, the aerospace division, that goes back into the aerospace industry and leads to better and safer planes, right?
Right, yeah.
And, and the human spaceflight program has all of this technological off spins that go back into industry and kind of keep that going. But the main product of the space science division is knowledge.
Right.
And so it's incumbent upon the return on the investment for that knowledge should be education.
Very cool.
And outreach. So, yeah, so the kinds of things that we do then are, education is very, very broad, and we typically divide it up into different types of audiences. And so there's one audience that probably most people, think of when they hear education. There's, kids in a classroom, right?
Right.
Teachers,
Sure.
Teachers and kids in a classroom, and we call that formal education. So you got, the kindergarten through 12th grade, and also we often do work with community college, and even sometimes with university level, but university level professors are often like, I know what I'm doing.
Right. Sure.
But so with that audience, it's often, we often are working with teachers to maybe design educational experiences or activities that they can do in their classrooms. We're really conscientious about the fact that teachers have such limited time and they need to actually meet educational standards, right?
Right.
And that's the big major thing. And so we often make sure that whatever we're developing connects this, really cutting edge and sometimes esoteric NASA science, right, into the actual classroom experience, So like one of the projects I worked on, we were the mission was studying the magnetic field of the solar wind.
That's super awesome. Wow.
Yeah, I mean it's awesome, right? No one studies the solar wind in third grade,
Sure.
right?
Right.
But what they do study is magnetism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we figured out how to do is how to incorporate, the way that we're measuring the magnetic field in the solar wind, comparing it to the way you might take a compass and measure the magnetic field around a bar magnet, in your classroom. And so we work, those connections into each other so that the basic things that the standards-based content that they're doing in the classroom is being reflected or is being connected
Right.
to NASA science. Yeah. So that's one of our aspects. Then we work with the even larger audience, which we call informal education. And informal education doesn't mean that it's it's just like, oh, we're just going to informally educate you.
Like flash mob of science.
Yeah. It refers to, people say informal education, what they're referring to is the venue.
Right.
The venue is a place where it's not, it's not a structured classroom. There aren't these guidelines, these standards that you have to hit, but it can be, I mean, it's after school programs, it's scouting programs, it's also museums and science centers, libraries, parks. We've been working with the Park Service a lot in the last several years. So, each one of those audiences has their own different issues. And so you always want to work with the educators in that venue to try to develop some kind of educational programming that fits their needs. And so, that's what a lot of my work has been. A lot of times it's helping those educators make the connections, right? Because, those educators, they don't have a lot of them don't have a specific science background. Even with teachers, right? Teachers who are teaching, especially in elementary school teachers usually have very general science background. If you're looking at a high school science teacher, they often have to have some more specific background. But even still, it's really, I think, been helpful for us who are trained in science to be able to work with the teachers to help them make connections, and that's work that I've been doing sometimes for very specific missions, like the one studying the solar wind. That one was called Stereo, had 2 spacecraft orbiting the sun at Earth's distance from the sun. But other times we work kind of really broadly, very generally for NASA science, and so we'll have a big broad topic like black holes or something like that, or exoplanets, or some kind of broad topic that we work with.
Yeah, what's really cool is that with this also that kids can then see kind of like what might be kind of hard, maybe a little opaque for them to see why it kind of like applies to the real world. They might just be learning, like core competencies, but they don't really see exactly how it applies. And then they're like, oh, wait, I'm learning this kind of, I'm learning about this. So this applies to that. And they can kind of make that connection as well, which might help sometimes in school is less than fun, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's always the thing, is trying to make it really relevant. Like the magnetism lessons, we were, having them play around, going around their classroom with compasses and trying to find out where are all the magnetic fields in the classroom, and finding out, realizing that, magnetic fields are everywhere, and making the connection between electricity. I mean, there's other programs that we do, like thinking about habitability.
Right.
around of, you can think about habitability of, say, an exoplanet around a star that we've discovered, or on Mars. If we're going to eventually go and put a base on Mars and people are going to live and work there, what do we need? What kind of conditions do we need to live there?
Yeah.
When you think about that habitability and you have to break it down, it actually makes you have to consider what habitability is like here on Earth, and it makes you think and connect to environmental science, which I really love. I like the fact that they have to start thinking about how interconnected all of the ecosystem that we live in is, right? Which they may not consider, they just kind of take for granted when you're here sitting on Earth, but when you're creating an ecosystem that you're going to have to live in a space station, or on a moon base or something, you really have to have this complete picture of how the water that you drink has to come from somewhere and go to somewhere, and yeah.
It's amazing. Very cool. So how did you decide to pursue astronomy as your field? So what kind of got you inspired to do that?
Well, I mean, it's hard to pick one particular moment, although there's like a few moments that like kind of stand out, right? As like, I remember that moment really strongly, and it probably, pushed me in the direction more. And I can go back to like one of my earliest memories, right? And it was seeing Star Wars, right?
I can see Darth Vader there in your background.
Yeah. Before the interview, I know I got to be me, and my office is
Very cool.
my office is filled with fun toys, from my youth and now.
Cool. So what was it about Star Wars?
Well, I mean, it was such an exciting thing, and it was so brand new. I mean, this was 1977. I was just like 3.5 years old, and it excited me, but it also excited everybody around me, right? I mean, it was one of these experiences where, like, the audience was just buzzing afterwards. And I remember my dad too. My dad was just like, "Oh my God, that was so amazing," and and so it just had filled me with a bunch of excitement. And I don't know if I'd seen movies before then, because it might have been one of my first movies. I'm sure, I think my parents had probably taken me Disney movies before or something, but this was the first, like, one I remembered, and it was about space, And we lived in a pretty kind of, not quite rural, but almost rural place where I lived. It was pretty rural. I mean, I was on the edge of a swamp, so I guess you could call that rural. But it was dark. Right. And I remember driving home that night from having seen the movie and just staring out the window of the car and look at the stars. And then when we got home, I just laid down on the lawn. Right. And I was just there for hours, just staring up there, thinking about all those amazing adventures that must be going on up there, and how I really wanted to go up there and be a part of them. Right. So that was like, I just remember that feeling of excitement about space kind of, got me going. And, we studied space in school, and I was just like, I was all over it, right?
That's awesome.
We studied dinosaurs, and I was all over dinosaurs. But man, when we started the planets, oh my gosh, I was just, oh my, I love this so much. And I was starting to get all the books from the library. Whenever we went to the library, I was over there in the resource section looking at all of the space books.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah. Well, and then another moment that I think kind of moved me along was visiting a museum.
Okay. Very cool.
We lived kind of up in northern Michigan, somewhat rural, like I said, and so the only closest big city was Chicago. So, one summer family trip down to Chicago, we go hit the museums, and we go to the Adler Planetarium, right?
Right.
The Adler Planetarium is this awesome astronomy museum, and the planetarium, and oh my God, I just loved it so much. And the gift shop was just filled with, I wanted everything in the gift shop, right? But the thing I wanted the most was a star map, right? This map of the stars, because, like, I'd always looked up there and I wanted to go up there and explore. And a map is like, it's your way to get around, what's what, where's what's what. So this map was like, oh, this was my key to knowing what's out there, right? So I got that star map, and I would spend all this time, outside looking, identifying all the constellations, and then my parents got me a telescope, and that just kept pushing me. And I mean, I'd have to say that by the time I was a teenager, I was kind of pretty set. I mean, I was in love with astronomy for sure. I don't know if I'd thought about it as a career, but I have to say that again, another sci-fi, Star Trek, which,
Oh
well,
yeah, Star Trek.
there's the Enterprise,
That's awesome.
and Mr. Spock.
Mhm.
I started watching old reruns. We got cable for the first time. We hadn't had cable, until I was like a teenager, and then when we got cable, they had the old reruns of the original Star Trek, right?
Mhm.
And I started watching these, and I'd seen a few episodes, I'd seen the movies, I loved the
Right.
movies, but when I started watching those old TV shows, seeing it was like one of the first times that I saw characters who were being heroes because they were smart, right?
Right. Yeah.
Not because they were strong, the strongest. They weren't the heroes because they were strongest and the bravest. They were
Right.
smart and they were solving problems with their brains. Mr. Spock, sure, Mr. Spock was strong and he could do the nerve pinch and whatever,
Mhm.
but like he always thought his way through a situation.
Right.
And
Exactly.
even Kirk, I mean, Kirk wasn't a scientist, but like, Kirk could, do make a computer blow itself up by trapping it in a logic trap. He was so smart, right? He could outsmart a computer. And I just loved the notion that, like, this idea of being able to explore space and being and doing science and being smart at the same time. So I feel like Star Trek actually was kind of the final push that made me think of a career in this in science. I mean, I think like a lot of people who study astronomy, I probably originally wanted to be an astronaut, right?
Right. Sure.
I figured that, astrophysics was one of the fields that you would go into if you want to be an astronaut. Some people become astronauts kind of through the other ways, either medical sciences or pilots, right? There's a lot of
Right.
military pilots who kind of go that way. But I was interested in the science and be a scientist, an astronaut, and so it just seemed like astrophysics made sense. And
Yeah.
so, went to
That's
went
awesome.
to university, studied astrophysics.
That's really cool. I think it segues perfectly like into just a discussion of how media is a really important tool to get people interested in different careers. And the fact that, you know, a lot of the time the first experience we have with science is even before school is seeing scientists portrayed in movies and TV shows. So you've posted on Twitter kind of this really fascinating analysis, which is one of the things I stumbled onto, which I thought was really interesting, about the misconceptions and stereotypes of scientists in STEM in the media. So what are some of these misconceptions that you've found and how can we best address them?
Okay. Well, there's some misconceptions which they don't just exist in the media, but they exist everywhere. But the
Mm,
media like amplifies everything, right?
sure. Yeah.
The media is something, the media sometimes is not just a mirror, but it's like a mirror, it's like a funhouse mirror, right? That like takes society and like look at yourself. Whoa.
Right.
um
Yeah.
But I think, one of the big misconceptions, and we learn it because of the way science is taught in school, is that science is just like this body of knowledge, right? That a scientist is just a person who just knows stuff, right? They're just smart, right? That's what a scientist is. They just know things. They're book smart. They know things. Science is a bunch of stuff in a book that I need to learn
Hmm.
and then remember for a test. That's science.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, that's the way a lot of science is taught. And it's still kind of, I mean, even when I teach, I have to make the point to my students that, what we're going to learn here and what we're going to do here in this course is not science.
Right.
We're not going to do science. You're going to learn about science and
Right.
scientists and what they've learned, but we're not going to do science because doing science is actually investigating things that we don't know, right? You take a science class, and in that class, you learn about stuff that we do know,
Hmm.
right? Everybody knows about Newton's laws of motion, right? Everybody knows about Kepler's laws of motion.
Right. The fact that science is not rote learning, it's experiential and like the differences with that. And I think also importantly, science is also about failure. And I think this is something, especially like in publishing, we don't really like to talk about it. We like to publish things that show things work. But failure is also a really important process in science. And I think that young researchers can often get like really frustrated when things don't go according to plan. But it's answering the questions that haven't been answered, right? So
Right, yeah, yeah. No, science. Yeah, that is true. That's something. Yeah, and we don't talk about that much either. I had a good conversation with a colleague about that too. It's a problem actually, not just about how we convey science, but
mhm,
it's a problem in science because
right,
people are afraid to publish their failures, right?
exactly,
Publishing a failure doesn't seem, like, oh, I'm not going to get further funding if I don't show progress, right?
right.
And that's a problem because people need to know the stuff doesn't work.
Right, or they're just going to keep trying it over and over again. Yeah.
Right. And there was it Edison or something? You know, Edison. It took him a long time to figure out how to make a light bulb, right? And he tried, you know, I forget the number, but it was like, you know, hundreds of ways of making a light bulb before he got the first one. And someone asked him, you know, don't you feel bad about, you know, all those failures? And he says, no, I figured out like 99 ways not to make a light bulb. And, you know, failures. You know, I miss this show so much. There was a television show called Mythbusters. I don't know if you ever saw that one.
Yeah, sure.
Mythbusters was great, and one of the mantras that they had on the show was failure is always an option.
Right.
And that you learned so much from failure, right? Because it often taught you, you know, you had one idea, something was going to work, and then it doesn't work, and you have to figure out, okay, well, why didn't that work?
Right.
Something I thought about this system was wrong, and that's super important, right? I mean, we often have expectations about nature that just don't play out. Nature is under no obligation to meet our expectations, right? Nature is what it is, and this is another thing I tell my students all the time is that, you know, you got to just let nature do the talking, right? You need, as a good scientist, you need to be a good listener. You need to listen to what nature's trying to tell you rather than trying to fit your ideas of how it's supposed to be onto it.
Right. That's a really good point. Yeah. It's the whole idea of like fail again, fail better, you know?
Right.